God's will.
What you're seeking is a blessing from God.
You must expect a miracle.
You have the power of choice.
Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ.
Welcome to Live Today Live. Randy Robinson here, and I've got someone that I've gotten to know just through Zoom, and he's become one of my favorite people, and he's probably going to hate that I say that. But Joe Amaral, if you're up in Canada, you've probably seen him on television. Of course, you see him anywhere on television over the years. Right now, primarily, he's doing some really great work. He just got back from Liberia, and I will ask him about that, and I'm sure he'll want to talk about it. But that's not the topic of today, because he has a book out that I think is very interesting because, you know, you read the Bible, you read the stories, maybe you go a little deeper and study some things, but there's something different about being in the place where the story took place. And I've experienced this, and you know, I'm the guy that goes to Key West and goes to the Hemingway house because I like Ernest Hemingway's writing. You know, there's just all sorts of examples. Of course, our mission work, you see it on television, but you don't get to feel the water and smell the water when we're drilling the wells, and it's a whole different experience. Well, that's what happened to Joe when he went to Israel, and now he's about to go on his 45th trip to Israel. Well, he has a book out called Understanding Jesus, and he's getting into as the subtitle says, he's getting into the cultural insights of the words and deeds of Christ. So we're going to walk you through some of that, hopefully to get you a little closer to the story of Christ. What a perfect time to do it in the Christmas season. So we appreciate you guys watching, whether you're live or in the replay. Chat is open if you're watching live. So you got some questions for Joe, feel free to throw them out there. I'll relay them to him and see how he responds. Joe, great to see you again, man.
Randy, I love coming on the show with you. I've told you that before. I love our conversations, and I'm so glad that I get to come back right before the end of the year, and yeah, before my 45th trip to Israel, if you can believe it.
Well, okay, but why do you keep going back?
That's a great question. For years, I was going 2 to 3 times a year because we were filming a television program in Israel about like the Jewish roots of Christianity. So, you know, my backdrop was Jerusalem or the Sea of Galilee, and you could fake it in the studio, but there's nothing like being, you know, on a boat in the Sea of Galilee. So I was going for that reason many times. And then we'd also do tours to Israel. I'm actually still doing them. We do 2 tours every year, and we give people the chance to experience Israel for themselves. And like you were saying in the intro, just to have that experience of actually being on location in the place, you know, kind of getting a sense of, oh, they're mentioning Capernaum, Bethsaida, they're mentioning, you know, Magdala. Oh, just having just the awareness of where things are. And then next time you come home and you read through the Bible, you have a big old grin on your face because you know exactly where it is. And it's just a wonderful feeling to be able to know where those places are, what Jesus is seeing, what Matthew is seeing as he's writing it, and just knowing what is beyond the pages of the book. So I love to go back for that.
Well, how old were you when you first went?
I went in 2002 for my first time. So I was 32 years old when I went for my first trip.
Well, how was it for that first time? Because I've never been. And so
Okay.
I can only imagine that it would be a little mind-blowing in some ways getting to see these places.
Yeah, it was overwhelming, to be honest with you. I didn't grow up in a very Jewish, you know, environment, didn't have a lot of exposure, definitely not to Orthodoxy. I didn't really see that in my everyday life. And, you know, another time I can tell you the story of how I even got sent, but somebody sponsored a trip, and so I went. And I remember getting on a plane from Toronto and flying to London and then changing planes in London. And that's where there was a lot of Orthodox men who got on the plane. And I've never been around, you know, that kind of a community. And then all of a sudden, at the exact same time, they all get up during the flights, you know, with their big prayer shawls, and they go towards the back of the plane because they got to face east towards Jerusalem to pray, you know, and then you land. And it's so terrible to say this now, but we're talking 20 years ago. I remember getting to Israel, Randy, going, wow, there's like a lot of Jewish people here, you know. It was so different than I ever imagined. And just walking through the streets, hearing the Hebrew language, getting a sense for how people behaved, their attitudes, just kind of everything, saying, like, this is where Jesus came from. Like, this is the bedrock. This is the foundation, the culture from which he came from. And so to understand him, I can understand these people. And so once I started adapting to the culture and the way they think and the way they speak, I began to say, okay, I know why Matthew wrote that way. I mean, that's a very Jewish style of writing. So it was really overwhelming. But after some time, you get used to it. I was given a private tour when I was there. And I'm going to be honest, I hated my first 4 days in Israel. It's not a good tour pitch, I know.
Why?
Well, it was during what was called the Intifada, like the Palestinian uprising. There was 4 suicide bombings a week in Jerusalem.
Oh, jeez.
And you go have lunch at one place and there's all these candles in the wall. And you said, what are the candles for? Oh, each candle represents a child that was killed in a bombing a few weeks ago. And you're like, oh my goodness, right? And you're kind of freaked out. And then my tour guide shows up on my 4th day at my door and he knocks and he's all happy. And he said, good morning, how are you? And I'm like, easy. I'm not as excited as you are. And he says, my name is Aryeh Bar David. I'm like, wow, what does that mean? He goes, oh, the lion from the tribe of Judah, right? And I'm like, whoa. And he goes, what's your name? I said, Joe. From Toronto. Didn't have the same, But Aryeh started taking me around the country and he kept talking about Yeshua, right? And he would say, oh, this is where Yeshua, did this miracle. And, Yeshua did this. And I remember my Gentile brain was like, I know he's talking about Jesus, but he's saying his name wrong. Like, I wonder if he knows he's saying it wrong, So here's the Gentile is going to correct this Jewish expert, and he says, well, his name was, Yeshua. His mother Miriam named him. I said, his mother who? You mean Mary, right? And he's like, what are you talking about? And after a while, it hit me. I'm like, oh my goodness, Jesus was Jewish. Like, that? And it sounds
right.
Silly to say today, he's Jewish. Of course he was. But what does that mean? Like, not just ethnically, but culturally, even his diet, religiously, the way he went to synagogue. So, wow, God, I've been a pastor for like 2 decades and I don't even know your son's name. I don't even know anything about him and his people. And so when I was standing on Mount Carmel, it overlooks the Valley of Armageddon. And I remember God spoke to me and he said, if you want to know me, Joe, then you got to get to know this country and the people who live here. And I took that as a mission. And I came back home and I began to study and learn. And all these revelations, which are normal to a Jewish-speaking community, they're like, of course this is it. Yeah. But we don't know that as Gentiles, as Christians. And it was like, aha, wow, moment after moment. And I started to collect that data and started to collect the information. And that's how the book, Understanding Jesus, was born. It was my personal experience. I never set out to write a book. I just wanted to learn more about Jesus, in his first century culture. And then that just slowly opened the doors and I began to travel and teach. And I've been doing that for 20 years now, which is hard to believe sometimes.
Yeah, you should know a thing or two by now. So
I hope so.
So you said something. You said first century culture. There's a couple of gaps here. And when we read the scripture, not to mention, thank you, King James translation people who made it very English in a lot of ways, Yeah. But we have a cultural gap between sort of East and West.
Huge, yeah.
And we don't. Most of us aren't farmers here in the West. We have them. Yeah, most of us aren't professional fishermen for a living.
Yep.
Again, small occupation. Not a lot of stonemasons or carpenters, however you want to look at tecton in the Greek. We don't even really think the same. We haven't been trained to analyze and think. The Western culture is much more, typically more analytical and more literal oftentimes, whereas Eastern culture a little more mystic in a sense generally, right? Mm-hmm. Plus you've got 2,000 years difference. I mean, the whole, one of One of my pet peeves is that question, what would Jesus do? Well, Jesus didn't marry, he didn't have children, he certainly never used a computer or an iPhone or a car or an airplane. So I kind of laugh at that sometimes. But there's massive differences between the
Huge.
culture Jesus walked in and the one that you and I live in today. How do we close that gap and get a better understanding of Christ?
Yeah, we have to put in the effort, because you're right. When we come to the scriptures as Westerners, and when we don't understand it in its original context, we insert our culture and we try to make it fit.
Yeah, we do.
I mean, we mean well. We want to understand this scripture, but it's so foreign to us. Like, I don't know how synagogues work. What's a feast? What's a holy day? What's kosher? I don't understand this. Sure. And so, we have this, circle, and we're trying to put this square peg into it, and we're forcing the scripture to kind of bend to our culture, but it has to be the other way around. And so what I learned when I came back was to appreciate the power of culture, because that changes a lot of things. Do you remember a movie back in the day, Randy, called My Big Fat Greek Wedding?
Yeah, I never saw it.
Okay, but you know about it, right?
I know about it, yeah.
This typical white American guy marries into this, loud Greek family. Well, I have a very similar experience. My white Canadian wife married into this loud Portuguese, obnoxious family, and my uncles were always yelling, and she thought they were fighting, and I'm like, no, honey, they're just talking about soccer, And you can misinterpret people's intentions when you don't know their culture. And so I began to do this with Jesus culture. And, first thing you realize is, like, no one spoke English 2,000 years ago. I mean, English is such a limited language. We have one or two words for some really big theological things. And in Hebrew, there's 18 ways to say the same thing. And so I learned that I had to kind of put on like a different set of lenses, because when I'm looking at it as an American, as a Canadian. But that's not what Matthew meant. Matthew, Mark, and John, when they're writing, they're Jews, right? Mm-hmm. Writing to a predominantly first century Jewish audience. And so many times Matthew would actually leave a lot of things out of the text, not because they weren't important, because it wasn't even necessary to insert. Yeah. Yeah. When he said, on the last day of the feast, everybody knows it's Tabernacles. But here we are 2,000 years later. What last day? Feast? What are you talking about? Right? And so I've often said to people, it's like coming here, if somebody came from a part of the world that never heard English and we told them right before it rained, it's like, quick, run inside. It's going to rain cats and dogs. I mean, they would just be like shocked. What? Where? How? I mean, right? And then if I wrote a letter to them and said it was raining cats and dogs, I wouldn't even explain it. They would just know it means it's raining really hard. And so we have this kind of phrasing in the New Testament where Matthew, Mark, and John say things and they assume you're Jewish and you know what they mean, and they don't explain it. And so for a while on my business cards, it would say, have me in your church, I'll teach you what's not in the Bible.
Uh-oh.
Right? Because it didn't need to be. It was an understood thing.
That's interesting.
And so understanding the culture, going back and researching phrases and learning about the synagogue system, learning about the temple and the sacrificial system and the feasts and the harvest and all that, you're like, oh, that makes so much more sense why Matthew wrote it that way. Of course, his Jewish brain wrote it that way.
Yeah.
So that's how we bridge it.
You referred to the Gospels twice and left out Luke. Is there a reason you left Luke out?
Yeah, Luke's a Gentile. He writes completely differently. He tells stories that none of the guys don't bother telling because they didn't need to. But Luke is reaching a Gentile audience, and he says, you need to know the background to this. Let me tell you this story.
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah, I'm actually writing a new book about the Gospel of Luke because, Luke is the only one who tells the story of the prodigal son. He's the only one who names Elizabeth by name. He's the only one who names Anna the prophetess, Zacchaeus, all the undesirables, the lower end people who weren't, popular in the other Gospels. Luke mentions them because he's trying to show that Jesus is the Messiah, not just for one group of people. He's the Messiah for everyone. So I omit Luke's name on purpose when talking about Jewish writing because he thinks more like you and I, Randy. He's a Gentile.
So, and that in and of itself that changes the way you read it, Honestly, I don't think that anyone's ever pointed that out to me. But
Really?
you know, it's,
Okay.
it's
Okay.
possible because I slept since then. I'm not going to swear by it. But when you get into this, well, okay, let me ask you this, because as you've gone through this, and by the way, anyone watching who's never, like me, never been to Israel, it's okay. There's
Oh, yeah.
grace to cover all ignorance in the sense of just not knowing, right?
Sure.
And it's not, so this is not like you have to go to Israel to be a Christian. We're not saying that at all. It's okay.
No.
This is more, it's really growing and getting in depth. And by the way, there are some great DVD, if you have a DVD player still, but there's some great videos that will walk you through much of this. Because of technology, you can see quite a bit if you can't travel. So don't for a second think that Joe and I are saying you're really not going to be a good Christian until you.
Oh,
go to
Lord,
Israel.
no.
Yeah, because
No,
we're not
no.
saying that. But there's a difference when it's tactile and you're there. I'm curious, Joe, because you've been through this, you've taken groups, you've seen people go through this. Are there any sort of aha moments where people go, oh, that part of the Bible now makes a lot more sense to me?
100%. One of the things is distances. It shocks people, especially in the last week of Jesus' life. He's up in Bethany, he's in Jerusalem, he's on the Mount of Olives, he's in the upper room, then he's at the house of Caiaphas, then he goes to see Herod. And you're like, how did he travel all that distance in one night? That seems like it would take a long time. And then you get to Mount Zion and you can see all the houses where he was in one view, and you realize, oh, the upper city is here. That's where the upper room was. And Herod, who lives really far, was home for the Jewish holidays of Passover, so he was in Jerusalem. And Herod's fortress is right next door, and Pilate is there because he's the governor. And all of a sudden, people are like, oh, that's how he was so. It was so easy for him to leave the upper room, go to the garden, pray, get arrested, go to Caiaphas, go to Herod. So even proximity.
Yeah.
Just helps you to realize, oh, it is possible. Okay, that's how it goes down. Walking through the Mount of Olives and seeing what Jesus is seeing when he says he looked over Jerusalem and he wept over Jerusalem. You can see the whole city from the Mount of Olives. And so it doesn't upgrade your salvation status when you go to Israel, but what it does is it adds color to a black and white book.
That's good. Yeah.
That's what I tell people. It's like watching a movie in 2D. Great, no problem. But when you watch it in 3D, oh, I didn't see that before. That really pops now.
Yeah.
And that's what a trip to Israel does. So if you do have a chance, I mean, of course, I would highly recommend that you go because it does put color on the page.
Yeah. Well, and if you can't go and can't go soon, you can pick up Joe's book called Understanding
Sure.
Jesus, and he'll walk you through a bunch of these things, and you'll be able to read it, and that's always helpful. That's good. That's a step in the right direction. But as you say, no substitute for actually being there. I'm curious. I passed a nativity scene recently, of course, and right there in the stable with Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, and some shepherds were some wise men, and I'm going, that's not right.
No.
That is not right. Has Christmas? Have you learned more about the Christmas story that maybe you didn't know before you went?
Yeah. One of the things you struggle with, I found at least, when you go to Israel and you learn all this, Hebraic background stuff, it's not about converting or wanting to become Jewish. Hey, I'm Portuguese. I am what I am. But you do question, why do we do certain things when we know this is clearly not the case, but we do it anyways? Like, why do we put tradition ahead of culture and context? One of the things that really changed for me was years ago, I had a chance to be with some Bedouins, some shepherds, of Muslim and Arabic background in the Judean wilderness. And even being able to say that, how cool is that, right? I'm in the Judean wilderness with shepherds and Bedouins. And we were just talking about culture. And they had these ratty rags with them. And they just kind of seem misplaced, and I wonder why they had them. And so remember the rags. We go to the story. Joseph is traveling from Nazareth with his wife and they're coming all the way down to Bethlehem. We're talking 6 days minimum. She's pregnant, so anything can happen anytime. And Luke, of course, the doctor, tells us that when the baby is born, that they wrap him in a swaddling cloth or with a swaddling cloth. And Luke's the only one who mentions the swaddling cloth. And it's interesting because I learned that the swaddling cloth actually has a medicinal purpose. It has a medical background. I remember when my kids were little, my mom, she was like, if the kids were crying, just give it to grandma and she would wrap the baby tight and she would rock the thing to sleep, you know. And we think of swaddling a baby, but I learned that a swaddling cloth was very different in the first century, and it's actually still used by the Bedouins today. And they're strips of cloth that you carry with you on long journeys, and they use it to wrap dead bodies. You anoint the cloths and you wrap the bodies. That way, if a person dies along the way, you can preserve their body until you get them to a place where you can bury them properly. And so these Bedouins were carrying them, which triggered that memory. Because I thought, wow, Joseph is making a 6-day walk with a pregnant woman. Childbirth is the #1 leading cause of death among women in many parts of the world still to this day. So she could have bled out, she could have died. So Joseph, being a first-century Hebrew man, carries his swaddling cloths, his death cloths with him. The baby's born. There's nothing around. What does he do? Doesn't even think. He wraps the baby. But it's beautiful because you see that Jesus is marked for death even at his birth, right? Right at the very beginning, he's marked for death. This baby is set apart to die for humanity. And just that little kind of background goes, oh, no wonder Luke is specific and says swaddling, not just some kind of a cloth. And so that taught me to pay attention to words. You know, why did Luke say it differently? Why does he repeat it? Why does he say it 2 times, 3 times in the text? What's up with that word? And very often, when you go into the background of the word and how it was used, you're like, no kidding, he mentioned it. It totally, again, doesn't change the story. Jesus was still born. Nothing changes. Right. But just that kind of color that is brought onto the page just shows you that God even used something as simple as, you know, strip cloths for burial to mark his son. So he's marked for death by his earthly father as well as his heavenly father.
That's very, very interesting. I did not know that either. We should talk more often.
We should.
Learning lots of things. Or maybe I should just take this book on the plane with me today and read it. Oh man, now I lost my train of thought. The idea also, my son, my second child, my oldest son, was late. And when my wife hit her due date, she was out walking every day. So it's not just they're, you know, first century remote. I mean, you got a very, very ready to deliver pregnant woman walking for 6 days straight. No wonder, you know, he wanted to be prepared. Because there's no mention of an OBGYN walking with them to Bethlehem.
There is not, nor a donkey. It's one of those things that we just assume Mary rode a donkey, but then you read the text, there's no donkey mentioned at all.
Not there. I'm gonna go fix this nativity scene over here. Hope they don't mind.
Please.
So. Very interesting. All right. I know we could keep going because there's so much in the book and so much in your experiences. By the way, if somebody wants to go on one of your tours with you, is that open?
Yeah. Just go to joeamaral.org/ and there's somewhere that there's a button you can click on Israel tours.
Okay.
Our May trip is already full, and we have, I think, about 12 people signed up for October 2023. So we have a lot of people from all over the world who will either fly to Toronto or they'll just meet us in Israel and pick up the tour.
Oh, okay. October 2023.
Maybe the Robesons. We'll see.
Maybe me and my wife. I need to. You know, it's a big trip though, right? It's a big trip. I want to ask about another big trip because you got a little jet lag and nobody else could tell. You look great. You sound great. But
thank you.
What can you tell us about Liberia? Because I know that it's a little dicey over there, so there's probably some things you can't say. But what can you tell us?
Well, we got back a week ago, and it was wonderful because my wife was able to come with me for the first time. And here we are talking about, you know, culture and being on location to get the experience. Here's Karen, who has been with me for these last 3.5 years doing ministry. about Liberia, but she's only seen pictures and videos and read reports.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get there, and then it's all black, it's all dark, you can't see anything. The next morning you wake up and you're like, whoa, where are we?
Yeah, different world.
And she says, Joe, it's so much worse than you could have explained.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can feel the chaos now. You can see the busyness. It's a post-Civil War country. The infrastructure has not come back, unfortunately. There's a lot of corruption. But in the midst of this, God has called us to plant this little community called the Community of Hope, where we built a school and we have 330 students, and we provide breakfast and lunch and a top-notch education. And we work with a former warlord from that Civil War who got radically saved in 1996. I mean, he literally wrote a book on it. I actually just happen to have it here.
Oh, wow.
Redemption of an African Warlord. And he goes into some of the most notorious and roughest of ghettos, and he rescues girls who've been sold into the sex industry. And we have like a military barrack style place that we bring them back to, and we detox them, get them off of drugs, train them, give them a solid Bible background, and then teach them whether it's seamstress, whether it's hairstyling, or whether it's
just a trade,
electrical, plumbing, whatever, just some kind of a trade.
Yeah, yeah.
And so even in the midst of such poverty and brokenness, God is using us in a very small way to bring hope to people who have just felt so abandoned and forgotten. And although it's difficult, you have to fight for every inch you take,
Mm.
But in the end, you see the hope in the eyes of the children, and you're like, you've seen it when you've gone to Africa. Just knowing that you're making a difference, even in just like this one little kid's life, you're like, all right, that 28-hour flight, those missed connections, that crazy journey. All right.
Is Liberia safe these days, generally?
I mean, it's safe as long as we always go in a group, and I'm always with my host. I don't venture off on my own, even though I'm getting known in the community. There's not a lot of white people in Liberia, and especially not where we are. We're in a remote area where no one goes. And so they kind of know me. Oh, they call me Kole, which means white guy in their language. Mm-hmm. And so they're like, oh, that's Joe Kole. He built Community of Hope, and he's with the former general.
Oh, yeah.
So like don't touch him. Like he's got good protection. And so even though I feel safe, I'm always with my host.
Yeah.
It's like going to downtown New York or downtown Toronto. Like, you just have to be smart and watch where and when you go.
Yeah. Which is an interesting point. I don't want to go to downtown New York these days. It was bad enough when I went a few years ago in Times Square, and it's just gotten worse. So there's an interesting thing, because you mentioned the sex trafficking that's going on in West Africa, and it's going on around the world, if we're honest about it. But that reminds me again of a little bit of what you talk about in understanding Jesus, because when we read the Bible in our Western mindset and we read terms like master and slave, we get a completely different idea because of the history of our country, but this chattel slavery that was different. Not to justify it, but just saying it was different in the culture that Jesus was in. And even terms like king and kingdom, that in now south of the border of U.S. and Canada, the king is the guy that we rebelled against to get our freedom and start our country. So this idea of a king and kingdom, lord and lordship, I mean, these are very, we don't live there. That's not the way we think. I'm curious if there were any, going back to the understanding Jesus, have you picked up from the culture maybe some terms that we just don't understand because we don't live in that world, like a king and kingdom or master and slave, things like that?
Sure. Now remind me, is this 1 hour or a half hour?
This is half hour. I know. I'm just curious.
Okay.
I was thinking about this morning in the shower, if we're honest.
Yeah.
I was like, I wonder if there's because that is one thing that we read, and I'm working on a book related to kingdom, and it's like we don't get. We don't think in these terms.
Okay.
I mean, we can explain it, we can get it, but we don't think in these terms. And I know that there are a lot of Bible terms we just don't think in, that if you understand the culture of Israel, you get it a lot more.
Okay, well, let me give you a 2-minute response since you're writing something about the kingdom. You know, in Matthew 16, when they're at Caesarea Philippi, and this, you know, Jesus asks, "Who do you say the Son of Man is?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, right? The Son of the living God." There's like a whole 40-minute lesson that we can do on that, which is just amazing when you know what Caesarea Philippi was. But Jesus makes a statement, right? He talks about giving Peter the keys to the kingdom,
Right.
Whatever you bind will be bound, whatever you loose will be loosed. And
We don't get that.
you know, a lot of people thought that Jesus was giving Peter like total, absolute power to make decisions and start this new church. But what I learned, and it's very open now, is that those were actual legal terms used by the rabbis in those days. So because this new movement was emerging that we call the church, people didn't know what to do. You had Gentiles coming in. Do I got to keep kosher? Do I got to get circumcised? Do I have to like go to church on Saturday? Like, what do I got to do? And so binding and loosing were terms given to rabbis where when you had a disagreement or a question about something, you'd come to your rabbi and say, "Hey, can I carry this on the Sabbath?" And if the rabbi thought it was light enough, he'd say, "You're loosed to carry it." But if he thought it was too heavy, you'd say, "No, you're bound. I bind you from carrying that." And so we see this in the early church at the first council of Jerusalem, where they're asking what the Gentiles need to do, and they said, "Well, you can't do these things. You can't eat blood. You can't do this. You can't do that. But you're loosed from the rest of the law." So binding and loosing wasn't like a term of, you know, like the way we think about it. They were legal terms, just allowing or disallowing things to be done. And that's like, it's such a simple thing, but it totally changes the power shift in that context, in that story.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting because like so much of the New Testament, it's really dealing with this shift from the law of Moses to the grace of Christ. Interesting. All right.
Yeah, I taught that's in the book, the whole thing about the keys to the kingdom and the legal terms. And if people even enjoyed this just a little bit, like seriously, the book is filled with all these cultural nuances that make you go, "Oh, wow, okay, now I get it." And so I hope people will feel a little closer to understanding what Jesus meant when he said certain things. That's the heart of the book.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. You know what it also does? It helps protect us from drifting off into error. Because you get some weird stuff in our culture. I don't know. We do it down here. Do you guys get any weird things up in Canada?
Oh, no, we're perfect up here.
Okay. Good enough. Good enough. All right, Joe, always a pleasure, man. I appreciate you and the insight and the work that your heart, you know, you're one of the good guys. You got the heart of Christ, and I just encourage you in that. So thank you for your time.
Appreciate that.
Anything else I missed? Is there anything you want to tell people that I missed? Because I want to give you every chance to tell all 5 people that are watching what's going on.
No, man. I'm Portuguese. I'm Pentecostal and a preacher. I need 30 more minutes, so you better end it now.
I'll end it by saying thank you for watching. If you haven't hit follow or subscribe or share or like, depending on where you're watching, do that now and come back. I've got some really good interviews because I will be gone for the next couple of days. Kathy Lee Gifford on Monday, Megan Alexander, and a lady named Jen Tucker tomorrow. So I won't be here, but I'll be here and hope that you'll be here. I will see you again live next week on Life Today Live.